History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 2. The First Civilizations. Chapter 2. Ancient Mesopotamia. This innovation raises further questions. Where did the raw material come from? There is no metal in southern Mesopotamia. Moreover, even in earlier times during the Neolithic, the region must have obtained from elsewhere the flint and obsidian it needed for the first agricultural implements. Clearly, a widespread network of contacts abroad is in the background, above all with the Levant and Syria, huge distance away, but also with Iran and Bahrain down the Persian Gulf. Before 2000 BC, Mesopotamia was obtaining goods, though possibly indirectly, from the Indus Valley. Together with the evidence of documentation which reveals contacts with India before 2000 BC, it makes an impression of a dimly emerging international trading system, already creating important patterns of interdependence. When, in the middle of the third millennium, supplies of tin from the Near East dried up, Mesopotamian bronze weapons had to give way to unalloyed copper ones. The whole of this sustained on an agriculture which was from an early date complicated and even rich. Barley, wheat, millet, and sesame were grains grown in quantity. The first may have been the main crop, and no doubt explains the frequent evidence of the presence of alcohol in ancient Mesopotamia. In the easy soil of the flood beds, no very advanced tools were needed to achieve intensive cultivation. The great contribution of technology here was in the practice of irrigation and the growth of government. Such skills accumulated slowly. The evidence of Sumerian civilization has been left to us by 1500 years of history. So far, this huge stretch of time has been discussed almost as if nothing happened during it, as if it were an unchanging whole. It was not. Whatever reservations are made about the slowness of the change in the ancient world, and though it may now seem to us very static, these were 15 centuries of great change for the Mesopotamians. History in the truest sense. Scholars have recovered much of the story, but this is not the place to set it out in detail, especially as much of it is still debated. Much of it remains obscure, and even its dating is often only approximate. All that is needed here is to relate the first age of Mesopotamian civilization to its successors and to what was going on elsewhere at the same time. Three broad phases can be marked out in the history of Sumer. The first, lasting from about 3360 BC to 2400 BC, has been called its archaic period. Its narrative content is a matter of wars between city states, their waxings and wanings, fortified cities, and the application of the wheel to military technology in clumsy four wheeled chariots are some of the evidence of this. Towards the middle of this 900-year phase, local dynasties begin to establish themselves with some success. Originally, Sumerian society seems to have had some representative, even democratic basis, but a growth of scale led to the emergence of kings distinct from the first priestly rulers. Probably, they began as warlords appointed by cities to command their force who did not give up their power when the emergency which called them forth had passed. From them stemmed dynasties which fought one another. The sudden appearance of a great individual then opens a new phase. He was Sargon the First, a king of the Semitic city of Akkad, who conquered Mesopotamia in 2334 BC and inaugurated an Akkadian supremacy. There exists a sculpted head, which is probably of him. If it is one of the first royal portraits. He was the first of a long line of empire builders. He has been thought to have sent his troops as far as Egypt and Ethiopia, and he drew Sumer into a wider world. Akkadian took cuneiform form. Sumer and Sargon's rule was not based on the relative superiority of one city state to another. His regime achieved some degree of integration. His people were among those which for thousands of years pressed in on the civilization of river valleys from outside. They took over from its culture what they wanted as they imposed themselves. This left behind a new style of Sumerian art marked by the theme of royal victory. Akkadian Empire was not the end of Sumer then, but its second main phase. Though itself an interlude, it was an important as an expression of a new level of organization. By Sargon's time, a true state had appeared. This division between secular and religious authority, which had appeared in Old Sumer, was fundamental. Though the supernatural still interpret, penetrated daily life at every level, lay and priestly authorities had diverged. The evidence is physically apparent in the appearance of palaces beside the temples in the Sumerian cities. The authority of the gods lay behind the occupant of the palace too. Obscure though the turning of the notables of early cities into kings remain, the evolution of professional soldiery probably played a part in it. Disciplined infantry, moving in a phalanx over lapping shields and leveled spears, appear on monuments from Ur. In Akkad, there is something of a climax to early militarism. Sargon, it was boasted, had 5,400 soldiers eating before him in his palace. This, no doubt, was the end of a process which built power on power. Conquest provided the resources to maintain such a force. But the beginnings may again have lain originally in the special challenges and needs of Mesopotamia. As the population rose, one chief duty of the ruler must have been to mobilize labor for big works of irrigation and flood control. The power to do this could also provide soldiers, and as weapons became more complex and expensive, professionalism would be more likely. One source of Akkadian success was that they used a new weapon, a composite bow made of strips of wood and horn. The Akkadian hegemony was relatively short. After 200 years, under Sargon's grandson, it was overthrown, apparently by mountain peoples called Gutians, and the last phase of Sumer, called New Sumerian, by scholars began for another 200 years or so, until 2000 BC. Hegemony again passed to the native Sumerians. This time, its center was Ur, and though it is hard to see what it meant in practice, the first king of the third dynasty of Ur, who exercised this ascendancy, called himself King of Sumer and Akkad. Sumerian art in this phase showed a new tendency to exalt the power of the prince. The tradition of popular portraiture of the archaic period almost vanished. The temples were built again, bigger and better, and the kings seem to have sought to embody their grandeur in the ziggurats. Administrative documents show that the Akkadian legacy was strong. 2. Neo-Sumerian culture shows many Semitic traits, and perhaps the aspiration to wider kingship reflects this inheritance. The provinces which paid tribute to the last successful kings of Ur stretched from Susa on the frontiers of Elam on the lower Tigris to Byblos on the coast of Lebanon. This was the sunset of the first people to achieve civilization. Of course, they did not disappear, but their individuality was about to be merged in the general history of Mesopotamia and the Near East. Their great creative era was behind them and has focused our attention on a relatively small area. The horizons of history are about to expand. Enemies abounded on the frontiers. In about 2000 BC, the Elamites came and Ur fell to them. Why? We do not know. There had been intermittent hostility between the peoples for 1,000 years, and some have seen in this the outcome of a struggle to control the routes of Iran, which could guarantee access to the highlands where lay minerals the Mesopotamians needed. At all events, it was the end of Ur. With it disappeared the distinctive Sumerian tradition, now merged in the swirling currents of a world of more than one civilization. It would now be only occasionally visible in patterns made by others. For 15 centuries or so, Sumer had built up the subsoil of civilization in Mesopotamia, just as its pre civilized forerunners had built up the physical subsoil on which it itself rested. It left behind writing, monumental buildings, an idea of justice and legalism, and the beginning of mathematics and a great religious tradition. It is a considerable record and the seed of much else. The Mesopotamian tradition had a long life ahead of it, and every side of it was touched by the Sumerian legacy. While the Sumerians had been building up their civilization, their influence had contributed to changes elsewhere. All over the Fertile Crescent, new kingdoms and peoples had been appearing. They were stimulated or taught by what they saw in the south and by the empire of Ur, as well as by their own needs. The diffusion of civilized ways was already rapid. This makes it very hard to delineate and categorize the main processes of these centuries in a clear cut way. Worse still, the Near East was for a long periods a great confusion of peoples, moving about for reasons we often do not understand. The Akkadians themselves had been one of them, pushing up originally from the great Semitic reservoir of Arabia to finish in Mesopotamia. The Gutians, who took part in the Akkadians' overthrow, were Caucasians. The most successful of all these peoples were the Amorites, a Semitic stock which had spread far and wide and joined the Elamites to overthrow the armies of Ur and destroy its supremacy. They had established themselves in Assyria or Upper Mesopotamia, in Damascus, and in Babylon in the series of kingdoms which stretched as far as the coast of Palestine. Southern Mesopotamia, Old Sumer, they continue to dispute with the Elamites. In Anatolia, their neighbors were the Hittites, an Indo European people who crossed from the Balkans in the third millennium. At the edges of this huge confusion stood another old civilization, Egypt, and the vigorous Indo European peoples who had filled up Iran. The picture is a chaos. The area is a maelstrom of races pushing into it from all sides. Patterns grow hard to distinguish. One convenient landmark is provided by the appearance of a new empire in Mesopotamia, one which has left behind a famous name, Babylon. Another famous name is inseparably linked to it, that of one of its king, Hammurabi. He would have a secure place in history if we knew nothing of him except his reputation as a lawgiver. His code is the oldest statement of the legal principle of an eye for an eye. He was also the first ruler to unify the whole of Mesopotamia, and though the empire was short lived, the city of Babylon was to be formed from his time the symbolic center of the Semitic people of the south. It began with the triumph of one Amorite tribe over its rivals in the confused period following the collapse of Ur. Hammurabi may have become ruler in 1792 BC. His successors held things together until sometime after 1600 BC, when the Hittites destroyed Babylon and Mesopotamia was once more divided between rival peoples who flowed into it from all sides. At the height of First Babylonian Empire ran from Sumeria to the Persian Gulf, north to Assyria, the upper part of Mesopotamia. Hammurabi ruled the cities of Nineveh and Nimrud on the Tigris, Mari-Hai on the Euphrates, and controlled that river up to the point at which it is nearest to the Aleppo. 700 or so miles long and about 100 miles wide. This was a great state, the greatest indeed to appear in the region up to this time, for the empire of Ur had been a looser, tributary affair. It had an elaborate administrative structure, and Hammurabi's code of laws is justly famous, though it owes something of its preeminence to chance, as probably happened to earlier collections of judgments and rules, which have only survived in fragments. Hammurabi was cut in stone and set up in the courtyard of temples for the public to consult, but at greater length and in a more ordered way than earlier collections. It assembled some 282 articles dealing comprehensively with a wide range of questions: wages, divorce, fees for medical attention, and many other matters. This was not legislation, but a declaration of existing laws, and to speak of a code may be misleading unless this is remembered. Hammurabi assembled rules already current. He did not create those laws de novo. This body of common law long provided one of the major continuities of Mesopotamian history. The family, land, and commerce seem to be the main concerns of this compilation of rules. It gives a picture of society far beyond regulation by the ties of kindred, local community, and the government of village headmen. By Hammurabi's time, the judicial process had emerged from the temple, and non priestly courts were the rule. In them sat the local town notables, and from them appeals lay to Babylon and the king himself. Hammurabi's stele, the stone pillar on which his code was carved, clearly stated that its aim was to assure justice by publishing law. Let the oppressed man who has a cause come into the presence of my statue and read carefully my inscribed stele. Sadly, perhaps, its penalties seem to have harshened by comparison with old Sumerian practice. But in other respects, such as the laws affecting women, Sumerian tradition survived in Babylon. The code's provisions in respect of property included laws about slaves. Babylon, like every other ancient civilization and many of the modern times, rested on slavery. Very possibly, the origin of slavery is conquest. Certainly, slavery was the fate which probably awaited a loser of any of the wars of the early history, and his women and children too. But by the time of the First Babylonian Empire, regular slave markets existed, and there was a steadiness of price which indicates a fairly regular trade. Slaves from certain districts were especially prized for their reliable qualities, though the master's hold on the slave was virtually absolute. Some Babylonian slaves enjoyed remarkable independence, engaging in business and even owning slaves on their own account. They had legal rights, if narrow ones. It is hard to assess what slavery meant in practice in a world lacking the assumption which we take for granted that chattel slavery cannot be justified. Generalities dissolve in the light of evidence about the diversity of things slaves might do. If most lived hard lives, then so probably did most men. Yet it is hard to feel anything but pity for the lives of captives being led away to slavery before conquering kings on scores of memorials from the golden standard of Ur in the middle of the third millennium to the stone reliefs of Assyrian conquests 1500 years later. The ancient world rested civilization on a great exploitation of man by man. If it was not felt to be very cruel, this is the only way to say that no other possible way of running things was conceivable. Babylonian civilization, in due time, became a legend of magnificence, the survival of one of the great images of city life, the worldly, wicked city of pleasure and consumption. In the name of Babylon was a legacy which speaks of the scale and richness of its civilization, though it owes most to a later period. Yet enough remains too to see the reality behind this myth even for the first Babylonian Empire. The Great Palace of Mari is an outstanding example. Walls in places 40 feet thick, surrounded by courtyards, 300 or so rooms forming a complex drained by bitumen lined pipes running 30 feet deep. It covered an area measuring 150 by over 200 yards and is the finest evidence of the authority the monarch had come to enjoy. In this palace, too, were found great quantities of clay tablet whose writings reveal the business and detail which government embraces by this period. Many more tablets survive from the first Babylonian Empire than from its predecessors or immediate successors. They provide the detail which enables us to know this civilization better. It has been pointed out then we know some European countries of 1,000 years ago. They contribute evidence of the life of the mind in Babylon too. It was then that the epic of Gilgamesh took the shape in which we know it. The Babylonians gave cuneiform script a syllabic form, thus enormously increasing its flexibility and usefulness. Their astrology pushed forward the observation of nature and left another myth behind, that of the wisdom of the Chaldeans, a name sometimes misleadingly given to the Babylonians. Hoping to understand their destinies by scanning the stars, the Babylonians built up a science, astronomy, and established an important series of observations, which was another major legacy of their culture. It took centuries to accumulate after its remote beginnings in Ur. But by 1000 BC, the prediction of lunar eclipses was possible, and within another 2 or 3 centuries, the path of the sun and some of the planets had been plotted with remarkable accuracy against the positions of the apparently fixed stars. This was a scientific tradition reflected in Babylonian mathematics, which has passed on to us the sexagesimal system of Sumer in our circle of 360 degrees and the hour of 60 minutes. The Babylonians also worked out mathematical tables and an algebraic geometry of great practical utility, and it seems likely that they invented the sundial. the earliest known instrument for measuring the passage of time. Astronomy began in the temple in the contemplation of celestial movements announcing the advents of festivals of fertility and sowing, and Babylonian religion held close to the Sumerian tradition. Like the old cities, Babylon had a civic god, Marduk. Gradually, he elbowed his way to the front among his Mesopotamian rivals. This took a long time. Hammurabi said significantly that Anu and Enlil, the Sumerian gods, had conferred the headship of the Mesopotamian pantheon upon Marduk, much as they had bidden him to rule over all men for their good. Subsequent vicissitudes, sometimes accompanied by the abduction of his statue by invaders, obscured Marduk's status. But after the 12th century BC, it was usually unquestioned. Meanwhile, Sumerian tradition remained alive well into the first millennium BC in the use of the Sumerian in the Babylonian liturgies, in the names of the gods and the attributions they enjoyed. Babylonian cosmology began, like that of Sumer, with the creation of the world from watery waste. The name of one god meant silt, and the eventual fabrication of man as the slave of gods. In one version, gods turned men out like bricks from clay molds. It was a world picture suited to absolute monarchy, where kings exercised powers like that of gods over the men who toiled to build their palaces and sustained a hierarchy of officials and great men, which mirrored that of the heavens. Hammurabi's achievement did not long survive him. Events in northern Mesopotamia indicated the appearance of a new power even before he formed his empire. Hammurabi's had overthrown an Amorite kingdom which had established itself in Assyria at the end of the hegemony of Ur. This was a temporary success. There followed nearly 1,000 years during which Assyria was to be a battleground and prize, eventually overshadowing a Babylon from which it was separated. The center of gravity of Mesopotamian history had decisively moved northwards from Old Sumer. The Hittites, who were establishing themselves in Anatolia in the last quarter of the third millennium BC, were pushing slowly forwards in the next few centuries. During this time, they took up the cuneiform script, which they adapted to their own Indo European language. By 1700 BC, they ruled the lands between Syria and the Black Sea. Then one of their kings turned southwards against a Babylonian already weakened and shrunken to the old land of Akkad. His successor carried the advance to completion. Babylon was taken and plundered, and Hammurabi's dynasty and achievement finally came to an end. But then the Hittites withdrew and other peoples ruled and disputed Mesopotamia for a mysterious 4 centuries, of which we know little, except that during them the separation of Assyria and Babylonia, which was to be so important in the next millennia, was made final. In 1162 BC, the statue of Marduk was again taken away from Babylon by Elamite conquerors. By that time, a very confused era has opened and the focus of the world history has shifted away from Mesopotamia. The story of the Assyrian Empire still lies ahead, but its background is a new wave of migrations in the 13th and 12th century BCs, which involve other civilizations far more directly and deeply than the successors of the Sumerians. Those successors, their conquerors and displacers, nonetheless built on the foundations laid in Sumer. Technically, intellectually, legally, theologically, the Near East, which by 1000 BC was sucked into the vortex of the world politics. The term is by then not too strong, still bore the stamp of the makers of the first civilization. Their heritage would pass in strangely transmuted forms to others in turn.